What's going on, family, man? I'm so excited that you joined us again for another amazing To Be Honest conversation. Today, I have a friend of the family, a familiar face, one that we know and love, and she is a regular communicator here at TLC as a host, as a preacher, also off the screen. She is one of those leaders here that has built the brand of TLC from the ground up since day one. As a designer and strategist and a million other things that she does. So check her company out, Subdue 28. And but today we get to know her a little bit better as a woman, and particularly as a woman in ministry. And we're going to have a candid conversation about the journey of being a woman in ministry, or journey of not just being a woman in ministry, but a black woman in the world and context right now. And then also today will be a little unique because Pastor Lauren and I will ask each other questions. There's some questions that she'll be raising to me and for this conversation. So I'm super excited. How you feeling, Lo?
I feel good.
All right, well, let's do it. Let's jump in. So let's start with we've known each other for a while now. You've been a part of building the brand of TLC from the ground up. Our logo, everything that we had, pretty much, color scheme, everything from day one, you've been responsible for. But beyond that, we've had a chance to just know each other as brother and sister and as mentor and friend. So tell me a little bit about just how, you've come to not only know the church, but just kind of our engagement and history as, it pertains to your journey as a woman in ministry.
So actually, our journey, you may not know even the extent of how impactful our journey has been. I'll start off here and maybe I'll say something humbling later so that your head can fit in the camera screen. But we actually met in 2012 when you were still doing Lifeline.
Word. Okay.
And you had came to my former affiliation's youth conference to speak.
Right, yeah.
It was you and Curtis.
Kurt, shout out to Kurt.
And it was crazy because I knew that particular day, I was just like, whoever this is supposed to be like a mentor or something. Like, we're supposed to have some sort of impactful relationship, whether it was ministry or work. And I had never, other than you singing at ODU with Elevated Worship, I didn't know anything about you, but I just knew. And I remember randomly praying that night. I said, God, bless whatever connection we're supposed to have and let him be able to see more in me than I can see in myself. Now, mind you, that is a very random prayer to pray. And this was like 8 years ago. I was 20 years old.
Wow.
And I randomly, Holy Spirit just led me to pray that prayer. Didn't know that you were doing campus ministry at VCU.
Yeah.
And I was getting ready to transfer that summer. So afterwards, you were like, I do Lifeline. You got to let me know when you get down to VCU. And so from there, it was just like we instantly just had this brother-sister relationship.
Absolutely.
And Lifeline, the college ministry at VCU, was such an impactful part of my development.
Yeah.
But I guess we can start off heavy. You actually were the first person I ever worked with in ministry as a woman that did not cross any boundaries with me.
Wow.
That I had no inappropriate issues with, or didn't look at me and be like, okay, well, you're just this for as a woman, but I want something more from you. You're the first person outside of my family that I experienced that with in ministry.
Wow.
So that was something that just garnered a lot of respect and honor out of me, because when you called me your brother, you really, really meant it.
Yeah.
When you called me
your sister.
Thank you.
To be honest, I was going to let you slide.
But you really, really meant it, and really mentored me. I remember when you were going through seminary, you would tell me all your seminary stuff.
That's what my wife didn't want to hear. I was like, hey, I learned that. She was like,
So you were teaching me, from teaching me things you were learning in ministry, to taking me with you to engagements, to allowing me to test all sorts of stuff out on your personal brand, and allowing me to help lead with Lifeline, and build a great women's ministry through that ended up being impactful to then that relationship carrying on into like the development of the church. But I think a lot of people hear like, I helped build the brand, this, that, and the third, but that investment really was like years in the making. And it came from you genuinely just like being like, this is a sister that I'm taking under my wing, and I see something in you, and I'm gonna develop it. And God has honored that prayer from 2012
Wow.
since.
Like, not even being funny, I did not know all the intricacies to that story. Nor did I know about being the only person outside of your family.
I've never told you that before.
No, ever.
Yeah.
So this is already, we're going to take a different turn. We're going to follow whatever direction we go. But one, that's humbling. Beyond that, I've always felt like, there's just this massive amount of potential in your voice, in your vision, in your heart. Not just for the kingdom, but for beyond the kingdom. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. You've done some TEDx talks and different things like that. But just to stay there for a minute, let's just name it. Right. So it is a challenge being a woman in ministry.
Yeah.
And again, right after this question, I'm going to ask you another question about just being a black woman in our country right now. But what has that journey been like? Have you already alluded to it, being a woman in ministry? And feel free to also talk about, I know one of the things that we said we would be open to discussing is how you talked about that mentorship started, but then at some point it had to change, right? And you were not, so let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that'd be a great place for us to kind of probably deal with something that a lot of people, I'm sure, who are watching probably deal with. I know a lot of men who are maybe even trying to be good leaders and good mentors to women in ministry might face as well. So, but let's start with what has been your journey being a woman in ministry, and what have been some of the challenges to that journey? And you can also name kind of how the mentorship part has been difficult as well.
Absolutely. So, my family history.
Yep.
I am fourth generation in ministry on my dad, sixth generation on my mom. And so ministry has always been like family business, if you will. Come from a very traditional apostolic background, but I knew my relationship with my grandfather, he's always been progressive for the context that we grew up in. And so there was never an issue of like, well, Lauren, you can't do this or you can't do that. And I know that that's been a lot different than a lot of my peers who have wanted roles or just knew that God called them to do certain things but didn't have the space to do it because they were women. So I will say that was an advantage. The family that I grew up in was very much, they believed in women pastors, they believed in women preachers, they didn't believe that women should be silent. And so, and I'm spoiled. So
I didn't say it, you did. I mean, but for those who know you, we know.
I'm a little spoiled. So anything I wanted to do, my granddad would let me do and gave me the freedom to do. So I grew up throwing youth revivals and leading teens and leading young adults. I grew up leading conferences for our national organization and doing Bible studies and all of those types of things. And so in my family structure, that has been really good. Outside of that family bubble is where it's been really challenging. And a lot of it is because much like the business world, even though women have come up in the business world, they've gotten more space, church and ministry is very much a man's world. Like it's just always been a man's world, and it's always challenging being the minority. When it comes to men, it's like either you're good or you're not good, right? When it comes to women, it's kind of like whether you're good or not, it's always just like you're cute. So being taken seriously has always been really interesting. And then what's been different about, I'll say what's different about myself is when it comes to like ministry, when it comes to like the things of God, I'm so focused on that. And I've always tried my best to just maintain a pure heart. And so it's been frustrating being in a space where you really want to honor God. being someone who's dedicated their life to ministry, their whole life to ministry is already really rare, right? But you want to honor God, and then you're in situations with men who are your coworkers by default, are your colleagues by default, and you want to do your job alongside them, and all of a sudden you're kind of objectified. And it's like, I can't see the God in you because I see too much of what I want to see. And so that has been really, really challenging. Finding space is always a thing. Being taken seriously is always a thing. And then being in a space where I think even for a lot of peers and when a lot of pastors and things meet me, I immediately am, you would make a great preacher's wife. Or like, you would make a good first lady. Like, no, like, how about I'm the one?
He would make a great first husband.
How about that?
Right. Yeah.
And that has been challenging even for me personally because part of like, and we talk a lot about like what you see in me as far as like the ability to eventually, you know, pastor at some point, and you seen all these things in me, and I just be like, okay. But part of that like friction is wanting to have a good balance between like marriage one day, and how a lot of times women who are lead pastors feel like they have to compensate for being a woman, and so they end up more maybe masculine than what is natural for them. To compensate for the fact that they're in a typical man's role, and I've never wanted to be anything other than myself.
Right.
Like, is it possible for me to have a healthy relationship with my husband and still be a leader where men typically lead? That's always been a friction. So these are like thoughts that I've just wrestled with over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. Wow. I think just staying in that vein, you lead here at our church, and we celebrate that and have been the better because of it. And I know there was a season, even in our friendship and brother-sister relationship and mentorship, where like things changed.
They did, and I was not happy about it.
So, I'll speak to that. Like, I'll be like kind of a little bit devil's advocate. Maybe not devil's advocate. That's probably not the right choice of words. But to be honest, like, we hit a point where the church had been growing, and as anybody knows, like, and look, whether this is church or any organization, right? You can lead a corporation, you can lead a coffee shop, you can lead anything. When something starts growing and it becomes more visible and it becomes more influential and people start to see it more, they start asking more questions. And they start to pick, like,
Make
problems.
assumptions.
So I still remember the first time I got in trouble.
I do too.
You remember? I remember the first time I got in trouble. True story. You had come to the church, and while we had always worked together, we were going to like officially have you come on board on a staff role for the first time.
Yes.
So
yes.
we had several iterations of that. And we were leaving the church.
I had just done my interview.
And it was a panel interview, and one of our trustee members, who is pure heart, but like, we were leaving, and again, I have a great relationship with your dad. I have a great relationship with your mom.
You're practically like our family member.
I'm a family member, right? Yeah. Like, your brother and sister-in-law have been on vacation with our family. So I'm thinking nothing of it, right? So,
and you knew from a big brother standpoint that I was terrified after my interview.
Right. So
I was still adjusting to like leaving my granddad's church.
Absolutely.
Emotions all over the place. So we walk out and you look at me and you're like, no, are you okay?
Yeah. And
I'm like,
at the time, you weren't driving.
Yes, and I wasn't driving.
So
I was scared to drive. So I
you
wasn't
were going to
driving.
take, because that's a whole other story for another day. You ain't drive forever.
But the Lord delivered me.
So here you are. We talk about all that context. We're walking out. It's the middle of the night. You're like,
it's raining.
I'm going to hop in the car with a random person. I was like, man, no, I'll take you home. And my wife approved of it. Like, my wife was like, oh, yeah, cool. Take a little home, be home, right? Man, I remember that phone call I got. Man, and I'm going to tell y'all straight up. It was a couple words in there that I can't repeat on camera right now. I was like, what are you doing? And I was like, what you mean? And it was like, yo, you in the car in the middle of the night, dropping Lauren off home. And for real, like, I thought nothing of it.
Because
like,
that's what we, and even with
Yeah.
Ash, like, I've had that relationship with the two of you.
Yeah.
for so many years.
Absolutely. And so I just remember that being such a turning point because, and, you know, and thank God for that particular mentor who, you know, we were able to have a real dialogue about the implications of some of
Yeah.
my decisions now. And quite frankly, you know,
Because everything changed.
and we both grew up in a small church.
Yeah.
And so growing up in a small church, I also was adjusting to the idea that people cared about anything that I did. You know, when you grew up in a small church, I think I just kind of felt as if
Everything's relational. Nobody
everybody's
really cares.
family, everybody's
Yeah.
second cousin, or everybody's made up cousin.
Yes.
So it was like, cool. And it was an adjustment to be like, whoa, wait. I have to be more conscious of what things even look like or things sound like. And so that kind of altered our relationship
It
for a
did.
season. How did you deal with that? How did you feel about it? You know, I see what was some of that like for you? Because I hear from a lot of women, and I think this happens again in every industry. So if you're watching this and you're not in the Christian context or church world, I think this applies to like probably every
Business
organization. But I know particularly in the church context, I talk to a lot of men who are pastors or friends of mine who are women in ministry who are like, I don't get the same type of mentorship
No.
as everybody else. So what was that like for you?
It was a big challenge. Well, I'll tell you, part of the reason why it was a big challenge was because on one end it was just a culture shock, right? And I understood also the fact that we also came from, ministry-wise, we were doing Lifeline, right? Where everyone is our friends.
Yeah.
At this point, the church was, one, going on, two, I was a part of the development, but I was not a member. So your congregation also didn't know me, and I didn't know them.
Right.
And so there was that factor. Then everyone else on staff outside of Crystal, who was on staff, were young men. So there's Rivers, there was our former youth pastor at the time, and they're like brothers,
Yep.
right? So I see Rivers, who was a friend of mine beforehand, right? But very much, it was almost like your dad picking a favorite kid. And I was just like, so you guys see Brennan and Rivers together all the time, but it was me first. That's the thing.
Right.
That's the thing about it. And so it was just like Rivers came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, y'all are going on the ministry trips and y'all are getting all the mentorship and the training, and I'm just like, well, doggone, okay. That's cute.
Yeah.
And so I think what makes that challenging, one, is because, and what also made it challenging is not only were we going into that, but at that season we were also transitioning to boss and employee because I was coming on staff. So it went from brother, sister to boss, employee, and you can't go nowhere with us. And so that was
I never
really,
said that, by the way. That was
he didn't
that was
have to
felt
say
and
it.
implied.
He didn't have
but-
to say it. He didn't have to say it.
that's real.
But it's a challenge for women in ministry because it is male centered, right?
Yep.
So outside of my aunt, who I'm really close to, you're my only pastoral mentor, and there aren't very many. Like I can count. I've got like 2 solid woman pastor preacher friends. And one I met through you and Rivers over the last 2 years. And the other is a colleague of mine who I love very, very much. But we've gotten closer over the last couple of years.
Yep.
And so I didn't have there wasn't like a woman to swoop in and be like, okay, well, it's okay because I can take you, like, it'll be more appropriate with me, so I can take you under my wing.
Yeah.
And I think what's frustrating is for a lot of women, we're just trying to do our job. Like, I'm just trying to do my job. Like, I don't want nobody. I just want to do my job. And so I think that is what becomes challenging for women. It's just like, okay, I get the connotation, I get what people think, but what am I supposed to do after this?
Right.
Like, who am I supposed to learn from after
Yeah.
this? Who can I glean from after this? And it kind of leaves you like you're getting some things, but then a lot of stuff you just got to figure out on your own because there's no one to teach you.
And I feel like, I mean, just, you know, and definitely not to say antagonist, but rather just to probably articulate the perspective of the good, you know, pastors who are men who have a heart for this conversation as well. I think for me, it was difficult because it was never like, all right, favorite, favorite.
Bye,
like, this is the
Lauren.
homie. Nah, it was for me like recognizing then the new pressures that emerged.
Yeah.
Because then what started to become, oh, nobody cares. Now it's everybody cares. So even if you are, first it's like, oh, well, you can, just connect anywhere. Then it's like, that doesn't look good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so you're like, I'm just trying to do my job. And then low key, as a pastor, I'm like, I'm just trying to do my job, not jack up the church. You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying not to end up on a blog. I'm just trying not to end up on the shade room for pastors. I'm just trying not to end up with somebody saying, oh, did you see burn so and so? And we know how it is. And so it was difficult because it was like, and let's name it for what it is. It was easier.
Yeah, it's easier
Yeah,
to
it's
pull the
easier.
rivers because nobody's gonna be like.
Well, and I mean, even from a budget standpoint, like if you be like, yo, we going on this ministry trip, we can get the same room. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
yo, just get us a double. I cannot tell you how many times, and not just with Rivers, but other, male young leaders, where it was, more viable because it'd be like, hey, I'm not gonna ask y'all to pay for another room. Like, can you just get me a double? Because I'm bringing somebody with me. Well, I can never do that with you.
Absolutely
You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yes.
or like, hey, let's just take a ride. You know what I'm saying? And it's like cool, but when you pull back up in your city or in any city, like when you walk in a church or to a speaking engagement, inevitably, and this has happened
This
to
has
us.
happened to us, yeah.
This has happened to us. Like you walk in, and people assume if you walk in with only a woman, oh, is this your wife?
No.
And it's like,
their
dang,
sister.
like then I gotta try to like, nah. I mean, she cool. And then like, why she with you then? Like, why she pull up
She's
with
a
you?
part of my team.
So it has definitely been, I think, a learning experience for both of us, and in our purest attempts and effort to not hurt the kingdom, like, and not hurt the reputation of the team and what God is doing. And at the same time, be like, but can't rob each other. So I think we
Right.
found probably a sweet spot for it now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But definitely that's been a learning curve. And I know the question has come up. I know you've been exposed to the conversation. I'd be curious to know what questions people ask you, because I know that it has come up, like where I stand on things. So I'm gonna stop talking. Like, what are some of those things that you probably heard that have come up in light of that relationship?
Well, I think it's funny because one, I think people really, I've noticed my peers who are in ministry, my pastor friends really admire our relationship. But I think it's because they're also aware of who you are and who I am.
Yep.
And so they're able, because they come from the industry, they're able to see
Yep.
this is a solid working relationship. And so that has been really good. I think what's funny though is because we really reach a space that's not super churchy.
Yeah.
I feel like the people that we reach come from multiple contexts, and so what we're kind of talking about makes sense as it relates to church politics, but not necessarily for a progressive women's movement. And so, because people don't get to see the investment that you make, a lot of people they only get to see like the Rivers, and they only get to see what you do with other male colleagues. And so a lot of those questions are like, so we only see you with men, so what's up?
Right.
But it's like completely different. Like, we worked so hard to have this great reputation by making sure that was balanced. And then in a whole nother context, people feel the complete opposite about it.
It's been great. So let me turn a corner really quickly, and I got a couple more questions for you. And just for the sake of clarity, I think, for those who might be asking, well, Vernon, where do you stand on this issue? Clearly, you preach at our church, and you are one of our pastors on our team.
Well, can I ask you a question about?
Yeah, for sure.
I want to know for you, because we come from very similar ministry backgrounds. Because we come from very similar ministry backgrounds, I know when I talk about how my experience has been with other pastors and other leaders that have not been great, I know that you know those types of people,
Yep.
right? They're very prevalent in our church background.
Yeah.
So what was the difference for you? Like, what do you feel like made you look at a young woman who was coming up in ministry and think the same way that you did when you see young men coming in ministry?
Oh man, great question. So I could think of a few pillar points right off the top of my head. The first is my grandmother. So my grandmother started the church that I grew up in her garage. Had no idea what she was doing, and I think, as I remember the story correctly, she might have been still smoking cigarettes when her brother-in-law, said, "We gonna start a church," and she just was like, "Cool, I'm saved. Let's do it." You know what I'm saying? As I hear the story, kind of. But no. My grandmother was an amazing woman, and she started the church in her garage. My daddy playing drums on pots and pans that I, eventually grew up in. By the time I came along, they were out of the garage, and they were in a place that was right on a railroad tracks with no central AC or heat.
Wow.
So
Okay.
I grew up in all of that, you know what I'm saying? But my grandmother was the pastor, and her nephew who was the pastor I grew up under, who was the man, ended up being the pastor of the church that I most grew up on. But she was always the assistant pastor. And I always knew her as the founder of the church.
Okay.
So seeing her preach every month, was formative to my discipleship and spiritual formation. In addition to her, I think it's vitally important to remember, like, I was the youth pastor at a church for 5 years before I came here that was co-pastor.
Yes.
And Pastor Micah and Pastor Jackie, shouts out, love y'all. Amazing couple. I learned so much from them about what it meant to just be in ministry and to see them legitimately lead as co-eldership, co-pastors, not like one having more authority of another,
Right.
but literally shared decision making. I cannot tell you how many times, love y'all, Pastor Michael would say, go do something, and Pastor Jackie would be like, you know what I'm saying? So to see that and to be formed in a way to honor the voice of women and to be influenced by her discipleship, so much of who I am now today is a result of, her voice and her leadership and her influence. And not just her, but definitely both of them, but definitely her as well. And then I think, there have been other pinch points or pillar points, but I think also just the idea of seeing it in scripture and theologically sound.
Yeah.
So like for me, like when you see Priscilla and Aquila plant churches, historically in the theology of biblical times, if they would have a woman's name first, it meant that she was generally, or that individual was the lead pastor and or the prominent figure in the life of the church community.
Okay.
So Priscilla's name always goes before Aquila, right? So to me, there's something theologically sound there about the nature of that church construct. We see throughout the biblical narrative like that. Like even if you look at King Josiah, who I preached on a couple months ago, I think at this point, you see that Josiah say, "Hey, I want you to go and talk to the prophetess to get a word from the Lord about what we should do next." A woman is the person that King Josiah is relying on to reform the relationship of the people of Israel with God. And we can go down the list about how women were the ones who primarily supported Jesus' ministry. It says that Joanna and Mary and them, like, they were the ones who financed Jesus' ministry. Like, I don't see how anybody reads the Bible and doesn't see an effective theological representation of women's voice in leadership. And anything that we do use is generally taken out of context.
Yes. Yeah.
That diminishes or oppresses the voice of women. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. So I don't know if that answered your question well.
No, it definitely does. And I feel like that is good to hear.
Yeah.
To hear where those formative ideas come from. Just because honestly, in my context, it's incredibly rare.
Yeah.
And I think even with what we do, being a predominantly Black church, I think the reason why so many of my friends who are pastors are always like impressed or in admiration is because they don't typically see a lot of women on pastoral staffs who are preaching and have a very, very I won't say loud voice, but a lot of space in the decision making and the operations of a church.
Yeah, no doubt. So 2 more questions, and I know at this point, we're this is a couple pieces, parts, but I think it's important to highlight the people like you, while you have had a consistent voice and commitment to ministry, you existed in the world beyond it. And so I want to highlight a couple of things there that I think would be, interesting to our listeners. The first being, and this is where a conviction point, in light of the present social justice movement, particularly the death of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Harris, and now Jacob Blake.
Yeah.
And let's not forget some of the ones that are coming to light, like Elijah McClain. I mean, just go through that list. I remember you convicting me and really holding me accountable as a friend and as a brother, in the most honoring of ways. But you brought to my attention how much we were articulating the male deaths and tragedies. And I'll never forget, I was just about to go open up a protest or a march, and they asked me to come and give some opening comments and pray over the protesters. And you said, I just think that we all need to be mindful that we are not highlighting the voice and outraged over the voice of the death of this woman. And I think that's probably by the time of this conversation has changed a little bit. And I see the NBA as one example of many people who are now raising a great deal of awareness, say her name, and raising Breonna Taylor. But when you raise this to me, I know for me personally, I recognize, wow, I have felt the deep conviction for George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. When I'm doing interviews, when I'm talking to people, I'm only raising their voices. But you're like, hey man, I don't hear you raising the voice of Breonna Taylor the same way. What has been your experience as a black woman in light of the present climate, and how do you feel like that challenge is manifesting in our present cultural context?
Yeah, because this is To Be Honest, I'm going to quote Malcolm X,
Right.
who says the most disrespected person in America is a black woman. And I absolutely agree with it.
Yeah.
And I think it is something that has been, I think it's something that's just been a part of America's historical construct from the beginning. Of course, there was men and women, right, who have been under oppression in the history of America. But men always get their rights first. Men always get their rights first. And I think what's interesting specifically about black women in the construct of society is black women are so dependable, right? They're so strong. When you think about who black women are in your family construct, you can always go to Big Ma.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
She's always going to clean up the mess, right? There's women who are always like riding for their men, riding for their children. And I will almost go as far as to say, I think because we're used to black women being so strong, we don't think that they need help or they need strength. And sometimes it's the strongest voice that often gets the most ignored. And I really feel like that's been the case for black women. And so I feel like when Breonna Taylor's murder happened, that was brought to light so heavily because you have Ahmaud Arbery, whose death unfortunately was publicized well after he had been murdered.
Yeah.
Right? And so we get his tape, and there's outrage about what happened to him, and there's all of these different things that are happening. George Floyd happened some months later, and Breonna Taylor happens in between. The publicization. Is that the word?
Publication.
Thank you. I don't know.
It's cool.
Before it got publicized. To be honest.
We're figuring it out.
All right. So Breonna Taylor happens in between, but what's really interesting to me is that Breonna Taylor experiences this, or unfortunately succumbs to this murder right in between. And if I'm not mistaken, if I have my dates correct, we found out about her murder around the time that it happened, or sooner, closer than we did Ahmaud Arbery, right? But we found out about it, but then there's nothing, right? And so it was like with Ahmaud Arbery, it was like, okay, well, we weren't able to like be in outrage because we didn't know about it. But Breonna Taylor, we did know about it, but nobody says anything. And then George Floyd happens right after, and you hear George, you hear Ahmaud, but then here is this black woman who's in her home right? And it's violated in her home. I honestly got to the point where I really was just like frustrated, like I was angry, because she and I were the same age. And so the way that men have been able to look and see themselves in other people, like even now, like when I think about Sandra Bland, I'm now the age that Sandra Bland was when she passed. But I didn't know whether it was like with Sandra Bland, like we got to see, unfortunately, like the picture of her in that crazy mugshot, right? Yeah. It was like, do we need to see an image of Breonna Taylor for us to have this outrage? Does there need to be a video the way there was with Ahmaud and the way it was with George? And so I really just kind of had this anger because I was just like, okay, but what about the Black woman? Like, she's right here. Like, what about her? So it wasn't like she happened away from these other two situations. It was right in the middle. And it just got passed over. And so it really, I think what made it so intense, though, is because it was a perfect representation of what happens to Black women. About our voice always being diminished, our voice always being looked over. I know so many women colleagues I have even now who hate their experience in the workplace, right? There's all of these things that either a Black woman's voice is not recognized, it's emotionalized, Black women are sexualized different than any other race or body of people. And then when it comes to even just like our identity and our makeup, like the fact that Virginia just now passed a law that you can't discriminate against the way our hair grows out of our head. Yeah. Like, we just now passed that law in 2020, right? These are things that are so like central to our identity. Like, it just became a law that the way that my hair grows out of my head, like, cannot be discriminated against when I go to work, when I go to do my job, right? So it just now became okay for me to show up in my full identity to go to work. And so Breonna Taylor not getting voice, like I'm thinking, as angry as I was about Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and that's the thing, Black women will always we just always ride for our people, right? And so I'm furious about Ahmaud Arbery because when I see him, I see my brother. Yeah. Furious about George because when I see him, I see my uncle. But here, I'm looking at Breonna Taylor, I'm looking at myself, and nobody's saying anything. Yeah. And I was just like, well, doggone, me and Breonna are the same age. If you find out, and that's when people really wanted to be calling out peace. No peace, no, yeah, right. Well, people were saying, let's handle these things in a peaceful way. That's the way the conversation was starting to turn. And honestly, this is not a pastoral statement at all. Yeah. I was just thinking, if I get murdered in my house, I want y'all to set the city on fire. That's really how I felt. Like, I don't want y'all to be quiet. I don't want y'all to feel like Lauren would want us just to be peaceful, and no, set the city on fire. That's how I felt. That's how I felt. Yeah. And so I was just like, who's outraged for her? And it was more personal because I was just like, that's me. Yeah. And nobody has said anything about me.
I don't think I can really add anything to that. And I wouldn't try because I think it's so personal to your experience and your reality in a world that I don't exist in. So I would just say this. I know that over our travels together, particularly over recent months, talking to a lot of churches, let's call it for what it is, mostly white churches, who've invited us in to talk about this, and many of those things you traveled to with me, and you spoke as well. Has anything changed? Like you just went from burn the city down. To be honest, if that's your to be honest,
that's how I felt
we're
in the
video
moment.
right now.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious. I know as we went to about at least 6 or 7 churches, shared our experiences with staffs and answered questions, and there's all types of opinions about that. Should we have went? Should we have not went? I mean, you never please everybody. But has anything, like, as you think about from going from burning the city down to where we are now, has anything changed about your perspective, evolved about your perspective, or maybe where are you at now in the process?
I absolutely. That might be my, to be honest, to a certain degree.
Yep.
But what I will say is, I definitely feel that another thing that I love about Black women is we're gonna make our space. And so I think that there was enough people who felt that the same way, who made sure her voice was gonna be spoken. Now, it's still unfortunate that we are however many months later and nothing has been done.
Absolutely.
But as far as keeping her name in our mouth and like still holding those that be holding their feet to the fire. I think that has changed, and I think that is really good. And I've noticed from our travels and our conversations that people are listening. And they really, really want to hear a perspective that's outside of their own. And I think seeing people coming from different mindsets, different perspectives, different backgrounds, sitting down and listening has been really good. I think the response that I've seen from white women in particular has encouraged me. I don't know if I mentally and emotionally would have been ready to do the work that we've been doing before now. But being in these spaces, there are women who, from my age up until their 50s and 60s, who I have regular conversations with even now. And there's nothing like across the board the empathy that God's placed in women as a whole. And so to see women from different backgrounds and different nationalities be like, no, wait a minute, you tell me what happened, right? Okay, now what can I do to help fix this problem? I think if anything, while I still may feel the same way if something happens to me, I'm just saying don't be quiet. That's all I'm saying. Okay, just don't be quiet.
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. But I will say that it has helped to soften my heart. And so my mom always jokes with me, she's like, you're like the Grinch when his heart grew.
Right.
And so I think having open conversations and being given a voice in a lot of these spaces has absolutely helped to really soften my heart and have productive conversations that can hopefully lead to some sort of impact and some sort of change.
Good. Well, I'm very grateful that we had a chance to have this honest conversation. I know for a fact that many people have these questions and will be encouraged to hear both your authenticity, not just in the ministry context, but far beyond it. And I appreciate you as a big brother. I'm super proud of you.
Thanks.
And and right before we leave, can you just tell everybody a little about Subdue 28? You have your own company. I just want people to know how to support you if they want to get some of the work that you do. So let me know.
Absolutely. So I have a branding firm, Subdue 28. We do experiential branding for organizations, for nonprofits, for churches, and for missional leaders. So a lot of personal branding, a lot of rebranding, a lot of organizational branding. We're very much steeped in strategy. And so if that is something that you love, our team would love to support you. You can find us at subdue28.com or on Instagram at subdue28branding. And I'm on Instagram at Lauren C. White Co.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining this conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again real soon.